way this started was I was asked a while ago to give a presentation on how sustainability issues increased asset values in properties. And it was for another group. And I started asking a bunch of people who did projects and were heavily involved in this, and like, how did this actually increase the asset value of the property? What came out of it was that a lot of people, we found out that the sustainability issues themselves, the projects didn't increase the asset value. What was more important was if you didn't do anything, how did that affect tenant retention? And tenant retention does affect asset value. So there is a direct correlation between the energy projects that you do and the tenants that you get in the building. So first is, according to the government, what's a green building? Okay, and a green building efficiently uses energy. We all know that. Shit, sorry. Rebecca?
Yeah, so you just click previous right there.
Can't see previous.
It's the second one. There you go.
Okay, it somehow got itself on a timer. Okay, but you want to protect your employees and you want to reduce waste and all the things that we know is important, in a green building. Okay, and so now we have how important is Energy Star, and we focused probably one of the largest REITs and property ownership organizations in the country, and they said if they don't do the projects, people won't come. Build it and they will come. So how important is Energy Star? And we found out that, we found out that if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, over 43% of those companies have some sort of defined energy goals. Okay? And most of those people are in the consumer products and the IT sector. Okay? So they have now defined, they've gone out to their shareholders and stakeholders and said, this is what we need to do. And then, I'm speeding this up to keep up with the slides. The Department of Energy now claims New York is number 4. Can you imagine going, we're number 4, we're number 4. But if you look, we'll pass these out. Oh, yours aren't going fast. We may have hooked up on a timer by accident or something.
Yeah, uncheck these times.
We're already collaborating. Next block to your right.
Oh, wait, so yeah.
You decide,
Oh, okay.
There we go.
There we go.
We're going to rename this the PowerPoint Working Group. You're all the flagship.
Okay, let's go back.
Go back.
Okay. Okay. So here's the graph on how important, what type of goals that the Fortune 500s are making, and really, what they're doing, what their goals are, and how do they make them measurable. And gradually, more and more Fortune 500s are demanding space, and certainly the lower, not the Fortune 500s, are now asking for it. As a member of the real estate community, we know that sustainability is a major issue. Then whether people actually get it in their lease or certain projects depends on the leverage they have, which some of our panelists will discuss. But this shows here, again, New York is number 4, but if you look at all the cities in the country, New York, and I think this started with the Bloomberg administration and his Energy Policy Task Force and some of the other initiatives, and leading by example, that the city has taken itself from number 12 6 years ago to number 4 in the country, and they're making a lot of progress. I think because of the initiatives that various building owners are taking, and the importance of sustainability and energy projects in society. Okay. And if you look here, this is a chart of the LEED, of how important LEED has become. And LEED started in about 2004, and it kind of hung out until about 2007, 2008. And then gradually, if you look here, the number of LEED projects, I think we don't even think of a building anymore, okay, that doesn't have LEED accreditation. How do we get it? And that's for the building, it's for the tenants, it's for everybody, and it's corporate responsibility as well. So what I want to do now is, and this is the way the program is going to work. Okay, I'm going to introduce each of our speakers. They're going to give about 15 minutes of then we're gonna take 2 questions for that presenter. So just gonna pick a random question, and then the next person is gonna go, and the next person is gonna go. And then save the rest of your questions, and we'll turn that into an interactive panel discussion with everybody. So we're gonna start off with, I'll introduce all the speakers now. So you know who they are. Nick Stolatis is, Nick is Senior Director of TIAA-CREF. They're responsible for about 125 million square feet in assets. And Nick is the Senior Director of Global Sustainability for TIAA-CREF. Okay. Then we got Hussain Ali-Khan. Hussain currently is with CBRE, but Hussain was Director of Real Estate for the New York Times when the New York Times building was built. So he has a unique perspective as an individual owner of part of that building and what drove some of the decisions that they made. And Dan is from Vornado Realty. Vornado is the second largest real estate owner in New York City. They're responsible for 25 million square feet in New York City, and Dan is the Director of Sustainability for Vornado. So we'll start with Nick and Dr. Day.
Good morning, everybody. Thankfully, it's not on the timer because I only have 3 slides. Before we get to the slides, just to give you a little bit of background on TIAA-CREF. Many of you may know this is a financial services organization. What many of you may not know is we are a nonprofit that was set up almost 100 years ago to support the academic, cultural, medical, and research fields. We provide financial services to that group as well as we've expanded into the private sector, if you would. But we are very much mission-driven. We pride ourselves on our corporate social responsibility. And when we speak of ESG integration, environmental, social, and governance, that's a key principle of the organization. When you look at a financial services company, we don't manufacture anything. So our largest greenhouse gas emissions are generated by our real estate investments. So if we are going to be concerned about the environment, we have to start with our real estate. We have been active in sustainability, if you would, since 2002 when we first joined the EPA's Energy Star program. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with Energy Star, but if you're not, you definitely need to become familiar with it. Our formal platform was started in 2007 when the realization by senior management was that we needed a focused and directed approach to sustainability. Previous to that, we had taken a typical institutional approach, basically said this is good, we should do it, and handed it off to our third-party property management firms. Jay mentioned we have about 125 million square feet. We don't manage any of that directly. We use third-party property management firms like CBRE, Transwestern, Cushman & Wakefield, to manage all of our real estate. My background is in the asset portfolio management space. I was involved in the direct management of real estate for about 35 years, 30 years. And I was asked to set up this platform to develop a focused effort to introduce sustainability. Our global real estate sustainability initiative, GRESI, is that process. It establishes what our standards will be, and essentially it starts with benchmarking. You can't manage that which you don't measure. So knowing how much energy one is consuming, knowing office space and now multifamily space, how a particular building ranks and rates against other buildings of similar characteristics is important information to understand how well you're doing. When you benchmark everything, really, you have to get down to it. Your budget, you have your target return yields. We've set up a similar program for our sustainability initiative. Using the Energy Star tool to benchmark our portfolios, we've identified 3 key metrics that we will measure to: energy consumption, water consumption, and reduction of waste. As a building owner, that's where we can have our biggest impact. So those are process by which we make sure that we are succeeding in that space is developing a scorecard. And we have a dashboard. An example on the screen here is a report that's generated by my team every quarter. It's circulated to the asset managers as well as to the portfolio managers so that they understand how we are doing. The metrics, since the topic is valuation, the metrics that I would ask you to focus on are in the middle of the screen, the estimated energy savings for the past 4 quarters. We track it for office, we track it for multifamily, and for retail. All of our wholly owned assets are being benchmarked using the portfolio manager tool. You can see the avoided costs that our portfolio has generated through improved efficiencies that we have implemented over the last 7 or 8 years has saved us almost a little over $14 million. Now, I don't know about you, but $14 million is measurable money, even for an $850 billion company. That flows either to our bottom line or it flows to the tenant's bottom line in the form of reduced escalations. One of the principles that you will find many real estate owners have is, well, the tenant's paying for the electric, what do I care? They talk about, the industry talks about the split incentive. The reality is someone's going to pay the bill, true. If we're in real estate to attract tenants, if I reduce my growth of expenses, I've suddenly made my building more competitive, more attractive to tenants. More attractive, I'm going to be able to lease faster, I should be able to retain tenants longer, all of which contributes to the ultimate value. We have a metric in here, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but if we were to take the savings and cap it at 6.5%, just on the office portfolio, we're talking about a $200 million valuation differential. Now, again, I said some of that savings is going to go back to the tenants, doesn't go to my bottom line. But from a pure dollar cap rate approach, the savings that we generate that come to our pocket lead to improved values for the portfolio. That's a direct benefit. You have indirect benefits that we're realizing, and they're intangible. In many respects, it's very, very difficult to try to measure these, but you know that you are going to be more attractive when tenants are looking for space if you can point to a history of reduced escalations. You will retain tenants more when you show them that their escalation growth has been flatter than it might have been if they were in another building. You have a next tier of discussions that we encourage our brokers to represent at. The principles that you have implemented, the practices that have been implemented to achieve these energy savings are proxies for operational excellence all around. I'm focused enough on my assets and how they're managed, on how they're run, to reduce my energy consumption in a measurable fashion, and I have the metrics to be able to prove that, then it goes, one can presume that I'm doing the rest of the management activities properly and respectful to the tenant as an operator. Tenants don't want to have problems. They want to move into space, they want to be able to operate, and really aren't interested in headaches. If you're managing your property properly, one of the principles I learned as an asset manager growing up in this business, the fewer problems you present to a tenant, an occupant, the better you are. The more likely you are to retain them when renewal time comes along. So, how did we do it? The thing that shocks me even today, most people when they start the discussion on sustainability, it's almost inevitable that they're going to say, well, I don't have the capital to invest. I don't have money to spend on sustainability, so I'm not going to do it. To me, that's the wrong place to start. From an owner standpoint, you need to examine and evaluate what your current operations are doing. If not benchmarking, you have no idea. You don't know what your relative energy efficiency is, you don't know where you're going to go. You don't know how to track performance changes. So benchmarking is the first step. Look at your operations. When we started this process and formally benchmarked the entire portfolio in mid-year 2007, we saw an almost immediate 1 to 2% improvement in our energy efficiency. When we dug deeper, the realization was that all of the building teams realized that someone was actually watching. Someone was actually tracking the performance. And they just took greater care right off the bat. We didn't spend a dime. There are projects such as lighting retrofits. Even don't do a retrofit, just lighting changes. People are buying 34-watt tubes. Well, why? The 28s and 25s that are out there may cost a few pennies more per bulb. When you think about how many tubes you have in a building, when you replace them, that 4 and 6 watts per tube multiplied by the number of tubes, we found that there's a payback less than a year. So it certainly pays to retrofit them, but even if you simply go on a cycle of buying the right tubes, you're saving energy, you're saving money. And that's a message that I continually reinforce with our asset management team, with our property management teams. It's all about saving money. When you do get to capital projects, capital is an inevitable aspect of some of these projects. Well, if I've saved some operational dollars and I have more flowing to my bottom line, maybe I can use that cash flow to fund some capital projects. Novel thought, right? It doesn't all have to go back. If the ownership is happy with the money they're getting, and you get more money because you've now saved energy, well, use some of that savings to leverage that activity. It's buying intelligent capital. We found too many times, especially in the older buildings, what had been designed into the building originally from a mechanical standpoint tended to be more than the building needed. If you've introduced sustainability initiatives on an operational side, and you've improved the heat generation because you got rid of all your incandescents, you've insulated the building better, your heating and cooling loads have been reduced. So that 1,000-ton chiller that you had that's now breaking down has to be replaced. Well, rather than going out and buying a new 1,000-ton chiller of the same make and model, maybe evaluate it and go in and buy a 500 to 400-ton chiller to replace it. More efficient machinery, you now have greater flexibility, and your operational profile has achieved even further energy savings. Utilizing these no-cost and low-cost opportunities has improved our overall energy efficiency. If I recall correctly, our average Energy Star rating across our office portfolio, about 32 million square feet of direct owned real estate, is an 81. So we're operating in the top 20 percentile. That brings me, how did we get there? The operational improvements benefited. I think one of the key aspects is connecting directly to the engineering teams in each building. What I have seen and observed in my years in the industry, most organizations have a commitment at the top. The chairman, the president will say, we will be green, and go forth and conquer. The message doesn't filter straight down to the engineering teams because there's so many layers involved. And not to say that they're not capable, but those building engineers are actually the key motivator in anything that goes on in the building. They control the operations. They tend to know who's going to move out faster than my brokers do. I always advise my brokers, go talk to the engineers, they know who's moving. But they're the ones that need to understand the commitment. So our GRESI platform from the beginning was key to connect directly into that engineering team, providing them direct support, supplementing what their organizations, whether it was CBRE, whether it's Western, helping to engage them and make them understand the commitment of the ownership to this process, and recognizing them when they do a great job. Recognition is another area that we think about when we're talking about sustainability. So you have the direct environmental benefits. You see the 43,000 metric tons of CO2 that's been avoided because we bought that much less energy. The market differentiation that sustainability brings to the table. Jay referenced that many more tenants are becoming very sophisticated in their view of sustainability. They have very knowledgeable teams that are asking the right questions, and we're used to get away with, oh yeah, we're green. They check the box and move on. Well, now they want to know what you're doing. They want to know how you're approaching the process. So you have to have a legitimate platform, the recognition both from the internal teams, whether it's an attaboy commentary, whether it's a bonus payment because they achieve some savings, whatever process that your organization seeks to employ will work. Even an attaboy is going to be well received and will encourage the team, will engage the team. As an organization, when we started this process, I told everybody we're not about the labels. What I had found back in 2006 and 2007, when we first started evaluating our program in 2002, was that many of the managers had stopped using the tool because, well, our Energy Star rating is so low, we'll never get a label, so what's the point? But no, it's not about the label, it's about the performance. So we pushed the performance, we avoided any discussion of labels until we were able to be confident that the teams understood the motivation, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by saving energy, by saving money, and that the recognitions would follow. And TIAA-CREF is very, very proud to be the only financial services company that's been recognized by the EPA for its energy efficiency leadership. We've been named an Energy Star Partner of the Year for the last 7 years, at the Sustained Excellence level for the last 5. We do use this in our market. There is a value to it. It's not the primary objective, but there is a value to it. So there's no question that having that recognition is an important feature. And achieving the performance to earn this recognition is the primary objective. Now, setting goals, setting commitments, we have our internal goals. Just to go back, we've got speedometers here that tracks each of the sectors targets, the 20% here. We all have the same. That comes from the Better Buildings Challenge that the Department of Energy has initiated back in 2011. TIAA-CREF is a commitment partner, and we have established that as a public goal to reduce our energy intensity by 20% across all 3 sectors by the year 2020. So we are measuring and tracking that performance, and we are looking to present that to our various stakeholders, both employees, internal to the organization, our investors, and the public with whom we are interacting with on a regular basis, on a constant basis. So it is important, not primary objective, performance. We want to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. And then the final slide is the inevitable disclaimer. So please memorize that. I don't want to get in trouble. And if there are any questions, certainly in the Q&A, we'd be happy to answer. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take 2 questions now for Nick, if anybody has any questions now. No? Yes.
Convince me you're thinking out of the box. There's many companies out there that attain what you're attaining, that however different their mode, their method of attack is, and that is identify ways to manage it so you can't control it. How do you take what you're saying, what you're delivering to owners, to convince the owner? Because I come across a lot of building owners, and I want to have a part in. It's not so much selling it to them, but showing them the results. But there's got to be something now out there that convinces you to convince someone that you're not like everybody else. And you're thinking in a certain way. This is why we're here for you. I know you mentioned the U.S. Department of Energy, how you're working in tandem with them in the
question, because it depends on who the questioner is. You'll find some people that don't believe in climate risk, and it's a lot of belief in, it has no merit. So the sustainability part of it is really just made up. There's no question that we're saving money. That $14 million of energy that we have avoided buying because of our improved efficiency efforts translates into dollars. Dollars that we put in our pocket, dollars that we put back into our tenants' pockets, and benefit both parties in the transaction. So from a financial standpoint, there's no question what we have done has resulted in benefits. If you have concept of mitigating your climate risk, then the carbon emissions that we've avoided are a very powerful statement. The fact that you can make that statement and have defined metrics is difficult to argue against. So where do you want to come at me, financial or environmental? I have the numbers that I can present to any questioner and be able to say, here's what we've achieved. Now, we can debate as to whether, energy, water, and waste are the only metrics to follow. The ESG integration I mentioned, environmental, social, and governance. There's efforts to introduce part of the social piece into the environmental piece. They all have their place. They're all actively involved, but when we're talking about sustainability, it really is environmental. So, having the information, though, in any discussion, making the business case is critical. We have one example in Bethesda, Maryland. We had a 90,000 square foot tenant that told us they were leaving the building because they had to be in a LEED certified building. And at the time, that complex had an Energy Star rating of 47. So it was almost impossible to consider that this would ever happen. We presented them our RESI platform, shared with them our initiatives, what we were going to achieve. We did not promise LEED certification. We simply convinced them that the platform we had developed, we were going back 2 years, will lead to improvements. And they renewed their lease and were so happy with the change that was occurring on that property as a result of the implementation of the processes and some capital investment. There's no question we could be spending capital money on that one. They not only extended their lease, they actually consolidated more space into that building. So we added another 35,000 square feet. We have a case here in the city very recently, property on 3rd Avenue. 40,000 square foot tenant came in and their broker spoke to our sustainability initiative as the prime reason why we moved into that building. So it's becoming a very important aspect to real estate. Is it the most critical? Not for everybody, really not. And not every tenant cares about it. But more and more are caring more and more every day. So as a risk mitigant, those of you who are responsible for local 84 compliance, if you remember the scramble when that was implemented, building owners were, they were just confused. What do we have to do? We don't know what we have to do. Well, all of our buildings had already been benchmarked. We had the metrics to go in and complete our local 84 requirements. So there was a legislative risk mitigant. There's so many different areas that we have benefited from. Really, the argument is, why would you not? Why would you pursue less than optimal, less than operational excellence? You want to be a Class B or Class C building? Well, there is that sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Hussain.
Oh, thanks. That's supposed to be yellow, but green's okay. Green's good, yeah. My name is Hussain Ali-Khan, and right now I'm a strategy consultant with CBRE. And you would ask, well, like, what does strategy have to do with sustainability? And I would turn that around and say, sustainability is all about strategy. And if you are a believer, let me change that. Just things belief. If you accept the climate change, scientific arguments behind climate change, then you must have a strategy for mitigation and addressing issues around climate change, especially if you're downtown. Even more so perhaps if you're in certain other cities. I don't know if anybody's been watching the news, but Sao Paulo's about to run out of water, right? Now that's like, was a major destination for private equity dollars to invest in real estate there. But once you run out of water, like, what do you do? Like, how do you like run a business? How do you wash your clothes? How do you make food? I mean, basically, you can't. You gotta leave town. So all of a sudden, the asset values in Sao Paulo are going to collapse, and this is all a result of misuse and politics and a bunch of other things. Thankfully, in New York, we've got a very, very effective system of reservoirs and water supply, and have been making significant investments in our water supply activities. But let me carry on a little bit more. Do sustainability investments increase asset value? It kind of depends on which assets you're talking about. Now, I come at this from a slightly different perspective than these gentlemen. And believe me, we're always looking for landlords like this. In fact, some of my clients are in your buildings, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. But coming at it from a tenant's perspective, you're addressing a slightly different set of issues. Because as a corporate real estate manager, and I think you're a corporate real estate manager, right?
No, I do exactly what.
You're an asset more
No,
asset.
ESG integration.
Okay. So I don't think there's any corporate real estate managers here, right? Okay. All of his buildings are occupied by corporate tenants who pay the energy bills, and they dwarf on a scale of 10, maybe 20 to 1 what the landlords pay, because the tenants are terrible energy hogs. And I'm not going to show you too many statistics here. Oh, how do you get that? Oh, well, let's stay here for a second. This is the New York Times building, and my primary claim to fame is that I was part of the team that developed this headquarters building. We have with us today Mary Jane Augustine, one of my colleagues early in that process. And we took this opportunity to make a whole bunch of sustainability type investments. Now at the time, LEED was in version 1.0. So you get as many points for bicycle parking and showers as you would get for energy savings. So we basically rejected the whole LEED program at the time and focused more on our vision of reducing waste as a first step, and then creating value for our tenants, namely the workers in the office space. So this building has underfloor air distribution. It's got automated dimming lamps and shades using a 0 to 10 volt fluorescent dimming system. It's got a combined heat power plant for 1.5 megawatts. It's got automated demand response. It's got the list goes on and on of the things that we tried to stuff into this project in terms of energy savings, because the Times was very sensitive to income statement effects, to run rate. And so if we could find ways to mitigate that, the way you've described, if we could make investments as part of this large project to reduce our cost of operations, we would do it. And we found a lot of really innovative names. Like at the time, this was like 2000, 2003, we were way out of the box, right? There's two other underfloor installations in the country of any note. One was at the PNC Bank in Pittsburgh, and the other one was at Alcoa, also in Pittsburgh. There were no automated lamps and shade systems of this scale. We worked with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs to test that. We literally built a replica of a floor in Queens, installed these systems on a competitive basis, and trialed them over the course of 6 months. Equinox to equinox is what we called it. And the results were pretty amazing. In retrospect, I'm still close with the building management team there. It's over 70% of energy from lighting has been saved compared to a baseline building that meets the code. So anyway, we had some really great adventures with the New York Times building. But really, beyond the energy savings, there's a lot more to it than that. So this is a pretty typical division of the costs of operations. Energy is a very, very small percentage for a tenant's operating cost. All other occupancy costs make up the other 8%, but talent is by far the most important element. And a 1% increase in talent productivity can overcome your costs associated with operations. So you can see that as a tenant, you're dealing with a slightly different set of drivers on how you're going to invest capital to make sustainability improvements. And there's also a psychological aspect to this, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is the sort of breakup that we'll find typically in typical office operating businesses. If you have, for example, industrial processes, in fact, I was built some printing plants in my time. The energy consumption is way more, compared to the number of people. In fact, we try to substitute capital for labor in those industrial environments, so that basically the building is a giant electrical box. It's pulling down like 11 megs every night, kind of thing. So it kind of changes the balance. But in an office environment, this is not untypical. And I would submit that as you go up the value scale, the talent portion of this index increases pretty dramatically. So that you can have energy 2, all other occupancy 8, talent 150, 180, 200, depending on the type of work that's being done in those offices. I know some of you are private equity types and investors, and I think you know what I'm saying. The talent wants to be where the talent wants to be. And if that means central London for asset managers, well, you just got to pay up, and you got to be where the talent wants to be. Now, necessarily the talent doesn't have to be happy, but it's got to be productive. So one of the things that we've been working with in terms of sustainability is to improve our energy performance by reducing the total amount of real estate we occupy. Now, many of you may have heard of things like alternative workplace strategies or advanced workplace strategies. From a tenant perspective, the workplace comes first, right? I mean, I could throw all these guys in a big industrial building in New Jersey and turn off the heat and stuff like that, but talent in this environment has choices. So what I try to do is try to maintain as high value a workplace as possible, and then change the idea of work from a place to more of an experience. Work used to be where you go. Now work has to be, how do you create value? How do you self-actualize? How do you use your talents to the best advantage of yourself and your family? So as a result of the sort of mega trend of the penetration of broadband, what it's done is it's allowed tenants to use different ways of working. For example, desk sharing is an example. You may have heard of that, or some of you may be involved in that. Sometimes called hoteling. Now it's, I think the new terminology is no fixed addressing kind of thing. In fact, our CEO at CBRE travels so much, generating enormous amounts of carbon, that he's decided not to keep an office. Right? So the CEO doesn't keep an office in the Los Angeles headquarters, which is kind of a crazy idea. And this is pure leadership by example. Bob Salentic is trying to advance our workplace strategy business, but at the same time he's doing it through personal example and understanding it from personal experience. This is a view of the New York Times building at night. It's a very transparent building, as you can see, and that's why we had to have the automated shades and lights, because otherwise we'd fry the troops next to the window. I mean, some of the concepts or drivers and inputs that a corporate real estate manager has to consider when deciding to make sustainability investments are different from those that you guys potentially have to consider. And it comes across in a lot of different ways. Landlords are important. What Dan was talking about in terms of the split incentive is a very real concept. And those landlords who make sustainability investments and improve the energy performance of their buildings are seen as one, lower risk landlords, and two, higher value add landlords, and we would seek buildings like that to move to in the event that we had to make those choices. And eventually you do have the opportunity to actually make a difference, to perhaps get out of the box as you described. But a lot of these sort of competing things, like the core business, tends to get in the way. So I'm looking at a project now, which is it's kind of a no-brainer. It's a 24% IRR, kind of like payback in 2 to 3 years. Chiller plant replacement plus an ice storage system. Right? Pretty conventional stuff. Shouldn't be too controversial. Cannot get the capital for that in our capital budgeting process. And the reason for that is because capital in these in tenant corporations has a lot of competition for it. So if I'm faced with a core business investment, and I've got a limited amount of capital to spend this year, and I've got these sustainability investments kind of on the side, I mean, it's no contest. I'm going to invest in my core business because that's how I'm going to make all my money. I'm going to sort of incidentally invest in sustainability stuff as the opportunity arises. So it's a little bit more opportunistic, which is why the split incentive or the landlords who invest in their buildings are very attractive, because then we don't have to make that investment. The whole business of tenant improvements is it's demanding for corporates, because tenant improvements have no direct return. The return is indirect through the productivity of the talent. So once again, it kind of comes around to talent. And then, of course, there's the concept of sustainability strategy. Resilience. One of my clients is a SIFI. Does anybody know what that is? Strategically important financial institution, AKA too big to fail. As a result of being in that category, they have to make certain resiliency investments, because their performance can affect the performance of the rest of the financial markets. So resilience is a really important concept. How do you stay operating? And because of information technology, it's not like you start off by having a bunch of seats in Jersey, right? So we could all just run to Jersey when New York floods or something like that. Or maybe it's like having some another business in another place. But now what we're thinking about is things like we have operations in 3 global locations, and each one of those locations is a failover from other locations. So that if New York is affected by Hurricane Sandy, then we would fail over to Pittsburgh, upstate New York, Pune, London, this sort of thing, for all those processes that can no longer be done in London. That is a really hard thing to do. And that's a kind of a sustainability investment that's not energy related, but that would trump an energy related investment every single time. So it's a much more complex environment for corporate tenants. And I'll be happy to answer any questions about New York Times building, the performance of those technologies that we implemented, and anything else that you guys feel to talk about. I didn't have a lot of slides about that stuff, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Before we ask Hussain questions, other than everybody just stand up for a minute, stretch your legs, shake your arms. Chew for a minute. Say hello to the person on your right, introduce yourself. Say to the person on your left, introduce yourself.
Okay, break's over, sit down. Okay. Now we have one break, it's not a coffee break, it's just a stretching break. Okay, talk about break. Okay, all right, everybody back on? We here? Okay. Okay, if you can get back to your train of thought, deep breath. Any questions for Hussain? Okay, two short, one long. Yes?
Okay, my question, and it'll go to both speakers and so
Nope.
far.
Hussain, both figures are for the panel.
Okay, let's talk about investment in, you mentioned capital, and there's always a fight for capital. Two types of capital, right? Capital off your P&L or capital improvements, which are amortized or depreciated dollars over a longer length of time. And what's happening is when it comes to energy conservation measures, people are coming back to what was said in the first presentation, you know, under a year return on investment. Well, that is the worst nightmare that all of us have in the room, is because if you take an asset and depreciate over 15 years, that cost hits your P&L over 15 years. And so your return on investment is probably in the first year. But for whatever reason, energy conservation measures are constantly being measured in their upfront cost instead of their depreciated cost on their return on investment. And that's why light bulbs are all that gets done. You know, as far as capital goods, they should be a depreciated or an amortized cost of goods, and that's your return on investment, not upfront cost. And so I was just wondering how at the New York Times and stuff you addressed that. You seem to put a lot of great stuff in the buildings, but all these facility managers are, what's your initial return on investment?
All right, first of all, there's only one kind of capital, right? And it sits on the balance sheet.
Correct.
And it can be a form of equity or debt. So when a corporation seeks to make an investment, they always look at, well, many of them look at their weighted average cost of capital to help them decide whether an investment is worth it or not. I wouldn't call it dumbing it down, but they simplify it by saying like, okay, well, I'm not going to make any investments that don't pay back in at least a year, simple payback, right? But, you know, as you have more options, then you can take a little bit more sophisticated approach. And typically, you use like, you use that screen, the 1 year payback screen, that I'm not gonna like even think about anything that's less than 1 year, because I can't compete for the other capital unless it's a short-term payback. But as you get more sophisticated, you start to see that there's better opportunities that will pay back over your cost of capital, and that will provide you the kind of returns you're looking for in, you know, as investments. Now, I'm not sure that I understand fully the challenge you're facing, but there are other ways to pay for energy efficiency investments. And you know, some of those are like leasing, some of those are like service contracts, things like that. And the challenge that I've found in those conversations is people will say like, oh, well, our cost of capital is lower than yours and I can borrow at 2%, so I'm not going to use your service contract. And so like, okay, then go ahead and do the project, and they just, you know, proceed not to. So, I mean, those are like weird obfuscations to avoid actually addressing the core issue. And even some of these service contracts can have lower costs of capital than the corporation's weighted average cost of capital. Like a typical financial institution is running around 12% weighted average cost of capital, though their borrowing rate is like 2% or 1%. So there's like a whole bunch of arguments in there to get over. But you know, it's a really hard problem, and I understand where you're coming from, because I tried to sell energy efficiency projects for the past couple of years, and it's perennial, it's everywhere, and it's really hard to get.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Egan?
Thanks. So we had two great presentations from Nick and Hussain, and I think that I picked up on a lot of common threads that I'll be talking about today. But I think, as Jay and I were preparing for this conversation, I think there seems to be general consensus that there's not a smoking gun here in terms of creating asset value or avoiding asset value decrease as it relates to energy efficiency. But I can give you some sort of general speak on what we do at Vornado, and then walk you through sort of a case study that we've identified over the years that has reduced operating costs and created value in other perhaps unmeasurable but very important ways. That's the wrong button. Okay. So just a quick overview that Jay actually got into, but we own 28 million square feet of primarily office space here in Manhattan. Our utility portfolio of consumption is roughly 300 million kilowatt hours each year. We're one of the largest buyers of electricity, certainly in our zone J. And so what that translates to is quite a bit of cost management on our side in terms of operable, controllable expenses. So utilities are commonly the second most controllable, well, arguably the first most controllable operating expense after real estate taxes for our assets. So what this creates for our group here at Vornado is quite a hefty cost and revenue management job. So Jay and I were talking about creating value through energy efficiency and sustainability. And one of the examples that came up for us, it's sort of a historical example for us, is we did in fact have a law firm tenant who had 300,000 square feet in one of our buildings approach our senior level management and say, our lease is up for renewal. We're recruiting lots of young talent out of Ivy League schools. They care about things like sustainability. They're asking questions that maybe we don't quite understand, but we think that they're green. We've heard of something called LEED certification, and quite frankly, we're not going to renew our lease in the building unless this building is LEED certified. And that predates 2010, and we sort of had a swift response for that building, and we're lucky enough that building could be LEED certified. But that's the one example that sticks out in our minds of sort of a tenant this was like a go, no-go decision with things like sustainability. And while I'm at a loss to identify more examples, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that our one example of reaction should only be one example. I think that the rest of it, we should be a proactive company. We don't want to hear another tenant approach us like this. We don't want another ultimatum from a tenant. What we chose to do was have a proactive program that then, let's canvas our entire portfolio and see, what do we look like? Which buildings can be LEED certified? Which buildings can get the Energy Star label? And if not, why not? And let's examine that problem. So here's sort of like a very high level view of how internally we'll view our assets. And I mentioned utility costs are a very high controllable expense at our buildings. There are countless people in our organization that are paying attention on a monthly basis how much we're spending on utilities. And so this is sort of a anonymous look at our largest assets in terms of dollars per square foot that we're spending on electricity. And senior level management looks at this and they say, what does this mean? Why are some buildings so expensive to run? Why are some buildings so much less expensive? And with this being sort of your only lens, you're sort of limited in terms of knowing anything else beyond what you're spending on utilities. So what we try to do is take the conversation, another level. We realize that the green speak only goes so far with certain people in our organization, and some of it gets lost on people. But what we can say is, let's take a look at our Energy Star scores and see what the correlation is between how many dollars we're spending per square foot and what our Energy Star score is. Now keep in mind the sort of decree from this one large tenant was, as a result of the tenant threatening not to renew their lease, let's LEED certify everywhere we can. So when we come back and say, we're not going to be able to LEED certify some of our buildings, they ask why. We say because the Energy Star score is so low. They ask, what does that mean? We respond with, well, we're using a lot of energy per square foot, and consequently it often correlates with we're spending a lot of dollars per square foot on utilities. They ask why. And so it's not a complicated conversation, but it's one that gets you to identifying the problem pretty quickly. And so where I want to go with this is a case study for one of our buildings, 888 7th Avenue, which is where our corporate headquarters are located. And I like it because it's not a LEED certified building. It's actually one of our middles in terms of our portfolio. And we view that as kind of the greatest opportunity to make improvements and create this value that we're all talking about in the building for our asset. So 888 7th Avenue, and we started talking about this building in 2008. The conditions back then, we have sort of your standard vintage 1970s curtain wall, single pane construction. 900,000 square feet. We occupy the top 3 or 4 floors. Not really sure what was going on in 2008, other than we knew that we're spending a lot of money on utilities and that we can't get LEED certification. So we needed to start a program where we started diagnosing what the problems were in order to come up with solutions. We had little to no visibility into our energy consumption. We had, vintage base building equipment from the chiller, when it comes to the chiller, the motors, the pumps, the fans throughout the building. The lighting was old. And we had, actually, speaking of the chiller, it was quite old and at the end of its useful life. And when we finally, got the building in Energy Star, we saw that the score was in the 50s, which everyone in this room probably knows is not great. So, getting sort of tying into what Nick was talking about, being able to manage what you measure, kind of step one that we did at this building and elsewhere in the portfolio was develop an infrastructure of sub-meters. Now, the sort of origin of that is not because we're green and because we're sustainable. The origin is that we have tenants that are consuming electricity in the building, and we need to recover, from a revenue perspective, the electricity that they are consuming. From that, we developed a network of pulse output interval meters that communicate to an RTU. We have all sorts of data at all of our buildings recorded every 15 minutes and getting computed into the cloud. Now, the problem there was we needed some way to translate this into bills. In 2015, this doesn't seem like that exciting of an idea, but this was 2008, and this was one of the first companies to come up with this. And as a result of that, we developed our own cloud computed portal where the tenants could go in online and view their sub-meter bills, and the more sophisticated tenants could go in and see their energy in near real time. So in this building, back to 888, we had 40 tenants that are now sub-metered for their energy usage, and that the recovery of the cost for that electricity falls on my desk in terms of just managing how we're doing in terms of billing on a monthly basis. In addition to that, while we had all these sub-meters at the tenant level, we have base building sub-meters. So we wanted to know how much energy is the chiller consuming, how much energy are the return fans consuming, some of the pumps and so forth. So while we were in our buildings sort of establishing this network, we gave ourselves a few tools to have more transparency into what part of our operations are taking how much of the sort of pie in terms of energy consumption. Next, I believe. So what we saw at a first glance was kind of a mess in terms of the energy that we were consuming. This is our steam consumption. So this is a week's worth of interval data. You really see no pattern in terms of operating hours. We clearly don't need to be using steam 24 hours a day. But this was the reality we were living with. We hadn't had the transparency to see what was going on at the building. As it turns out, this was a diagnostic tool that helped us identify leaks in our system. We were, in fact, turning off our equipment at night, but we were still calling for steam from the Con Ed grid. And anyone who pays a steam bill in this room knows that that's quite an expensive problem to have. So we were able to sort of swiftly address this problem, and now we have this sort of beautiful usage pattern that goes down after hours and spikes a little bit in the morning when we start our systems up. And I'll show you how we got value out of that later. So another example is the tenant use. So we are a tenant in this building. We're, as I mentioned, our headquarters are in this building. So we decided to make ourselves sort of a pilot case for the LED conversation, which going back now, this was probably 2010, 2011, we had over 1,000 MR16 bulbs in our office that I'm pretty sure were on almost 24 hours a day. And we tested quite a few LED products over a year to see what we were comfortable with and what performed well. And as a result of that, we replaced these 50-watt halogen bulbs with 6-watt LED bulbs, thinking, you know, this is going to be great, we're going to save a little bit of energy for the space. Because we are a tenant in the building, we have access to this, again, this interval data that helps us quantify just how much energy we're saving. We were sort of blown away to realize that just by changing these light bulbs, just a selection of our light bulbs, we saved 30% of the overall energy that our whole office was consuming. So we were kind of really surprised to see how much of our electricity was going to lighting. And this is not the best example, but you can sort of see here, these are the 4 weeks preceding our lighting retrofit, and this is immediately the week afterwards. So because it's also tied to our billing, we're able to see not just kilowatt hours, but dollars and cents that we've saved over the years. And this had a beautiful below 2-year payback period for us. So next, looking at this chiller, and I think Hussain touched on this very well. You know, from a capital perspective, we're not going to start. It's a non-starter to just approach ownership and say, you got to get a more efficient chiller in your building. You know, unless there's a need otherwise to replace or upgrade your chiller smartly. I still, if anyone in this room knows how to convince ownership to do that, I'll have a conversation after this is over. But so we had this opportunity to replace our steam turbines with something more efficient, and we elected to go with an electric chiller. One, because of the efficiency that it was, you know, the efficiency rating that it had, but two, because they recognize a need or an opportunity in the ability to switch from electric to steam during the summer and winter months. So this was one of our turbines was replaced with this it's a York Carrier, excuse me, a Carrier chiller. The other is still steam, so now we have sort of dual fuel switching, and what that has enabled us to do during demand response events in subsequent years is we created another value stream for the project in terms of demand response revenue that the building can make during these events. So down to the numbers. Here are the sort of the progress points that we've had over the last, call it 6 years now. We've gone from $6.12 a square foot in utility costs down to $4.91 in 2015, and we have seen our Energy Star score go up from this sort of pathetic number in the 50s to what we're targeting to be an Energy Star score in 2015. And the Energy Star score of 75 will mean hopefully we will be able to move forward with LEED certification. And you know, what this tells us is it's a long road for some of these buildings, but the your ability to measure your success in terms of not just energy savings, because energy savings don't mean something to everybody. If you can translate it into dollar savings, I think the conversation takes you a lot further. And so what we sort of learned about that, this sort of story, is that for us anyways, that there are several steps to it. That it's identifying these problems, it's empowering your on-site staff. You say, you know, these are your issues. Let's work together. What are your priorities at the building? What needs to be replaced? We deployed our capital gradually and strategically. So, you know, this chiller conversation was something that they've been talking about replacing the chiller for at least 10 years, I would say, before we actually pulled the trigger. It happened at a time when we were talking about energy efficiency, and perhaps there were rebates involved, ways to take advantage of reducing your costs and maximizing your value. Translate and report your results so your audience recognizes your success. Like, you know, everyone in this room knows what a kilowatt hour is, but not everybody back at the office does. And then at the end, you know, figure out ways to innovate. You know, now that you've kind of accomplished one round of projects. What's next on the horizon for this building? I believe that's the answer.
Okay, do we have any questions for Dan? Continue for a moment? Any questions? Ryan, any questions?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
On your lighting retrofit,
Yeah.
did you include controls, like occupancy sensors and stuff?
No, we actually, I mean, this was in 2010, and the space had already been designed, right? So we didn't have office-wide controls. Certainly there were not. Some were in a conference room, some were in the hallway, some were in a private office. And so this particular bulb, because we found a replacement that, and at the end of the day, the reason it was selected is that nobody could tell the difference. Nobody knew that we were replacing the bulb. And so just manual on and off, schedule yielded those results.
Wow, that's great.
And if I can add on that MR16, that's a wonderful device because not only do you have your energy savings, but you've got labor savings. As a building owner, it's not just the power that's being consumed, it's actually having somebody climb a ladder, change a bulb. The MR16s, they blow out after a year, 6 months, 9 months. So you gotta send somebody up a ladder a lot, put an LED in, and they last 5 years. Suddenly the labor savings dwarf what you're doing in energy savings. And that's part of the calculation that a building owner or a manager should be introducing in the discussions with whoever's controlling the purse strings to be able to make the case. But it's looking at it holistically.
So we're going on for general questions. I just want to throw some numbers out at you to kind of make the case of making an investment or not making an investment. And here are the options. We talked about attraction of tenants and tenant retention. So when a tenant renews their space, there's no downtime in the building. You're not going to have many brokerage fees for renewals, and for those of us who pay brokerage fees, they know they can be substantial. And you've got less tenant installation. Tenant renews, the space is built, there may be some improvements, but you're not gutting the space. Okay? You're not paying 1.5 times the brokerage fees, both sides of the fence. You're not doing a full tenant installation, and you're not facing that loss of income that it takes to hold the space. And what I wanted to point out, this graph is a little hard, but here's an example. We have a 750,000 foot building and it has 88% occupancy, and the rent is $50 a foot, and we use a cap rate of 5%, not 6. We're a little more conservative than New York.
It's not in New York.
It's just not in New York. So if you're able to renew the space, okay, even if you only get a 1% increase in occupancy, okay, and I mean a 3% increase in occupancy and a 1% increase in rent, which are extremely conservative numbers, using that cap rate, there's additional value to the building of over $26 million. Okay, so that's a lot of money. You look at an institution, you look at Nick's portfolio, Dan's portfolio, that is a lot of money for tenant retention and getting people. If you don't do it, and you lose 3% of your tenancy, and you have a 1% loss in that rent value, if you lose, the building loses at a 5% cap rate, $29 million. So here's, the prospect of losing a tenant or not having the tools to attract the tenant are really significant. This is not about little dollars and cents anymore. You're talking minimal savings, minimal reductions for really, really big dollars. So I think some of the steps that we've learned is you've got to take the proactive steps. You've got to do what Nick does, and I know Dan does, is monitor that stuff. Measure the before and the after. Okay? This create the value. And a lot of this is on lease structure. And one of the things Dan didn't mention, but Hussain mentioned in his green lease list, is most of the leases in New York have operating escalations. those escalations allow the tenants to share in the cost of capital projects, provided you can show the tenants there will be a savings in the operating escalation. So these projects that Dan does and Nick may do in some of his properties, there is tenant participation in this, and a lot of the landlords use what we call a green lease. And sometimes tenants want, like the first quote green lease was Wilbur Hale at 7 World Trade Center, and they wanted a new chiller plant, very efficient chiller plant. And the depreciation for a chiller plant is a 20, 25-year life cycle. Okay, and so Silverstein said, well, what happens? Tenant's going to move earlier than that. How do I get my money back? And basically, a non-fancy term for a fancy structure was it was accelerated depreciation. So plant was depreciated after, I believe, 15 years, but it was co-payback with the tenant's expiration date. Okay, so the tenant wanted the participation, and Silverstein accommodated that value. Okay, and my parting thoughts here is, you know, we've seen a cultural shift. I mean, I've been doing this stuff for years, and I'm going back to the 70s. And when I told people I did sustainability and energy stuff, my kids couldn't explain it. They told their friends I was an accountant. Okay. Now they say, oh, my dad does energy conservation and sustainability and environmental issues, and they're cool. So this is a culture shift. They have master's programs now in this, online programs. A friend of mine just got her master's in sustainability from Harvard, and she did it online. So this is now the people coming out of school, the millennials, they know this stuff. They grow up with this stuff. The Bloomberg administration, through their policy task force, got this into the curriculum of New York City elementary schools. So there's an awareness. And as these people grow up, this is an expectation now, not just a cost issue. And we're always dealing now, we've got, again, from a culture change. Are we creating a new class of buildings? Are we creating a sub-class A, which are buildings that look nice, but don't have the functionality of the buildings that Nick and Dan have, where they make those investments for tenant attraction? So we've got different building classifications. And even the Bs and the Cs are now recognizing that the younger talent, which Hussain brought up, the expectations, I want to be in a workplace that contributes to society, is really, really there. It is visible. You can't sit through a lease negotiation with a tech tenant, a legal firm, financial institution that does not address these issues. And consequently, we're seeing lots and lots of new technology. Most of you know in the room that batteries are getting really big. I'm starting to see contracts now for the shared energy tenancy, which is a new concept for battery storage, where landlords take space that is unrentable, maybe parking spaces, maybe in a machine room, maybe in a sub-basement space, where they're putting batteries in, and they're sharing in the revenue that these batteries create by charging at night and deploying them during the daytime and saving energy, and it's all clean and they have viable paybacks. The paybacks are very important, but that's a technology that's being adopted very quickly. We've got thermal storage, we've got solar, which is trying to make more inputs in New York City, but the city has a program now that you can actually, if you build a solar farm in Staten Island, you can get credit for it for your properties in New York. So there are savings there because they're recognizing the contribution in the grid. But key is, again, the data. As Nick mentioned, and I know that Dan has it as well, you've got to really develop what those KPIs are, what your key performance indicators are. You have to have the data. You have to have the facts that you can present to a tenant. And it may not make them different, but you have to have the data, the responsibility. Here's what we did. It's ultimately, if you're the tenant, it's your choice. You've got 5 other buildings. You've got it under control. It's not about can he do better or can he do worse. This is what he's doing. If that's good enough for you, and that's a driver for all your other forces, then you'll take the space. I think that's what everybody's objective here is. You can't sell a project unless you're gonna predict what's going to happen. I'm putting this in, here's what the results are gonna be. Here's my financial aspects, here's my social aspects. You've gotta know what's gonna happen. And you can't lose sight of what's new. Because everything we're discussing now, we know that there are gonna be new technologies, new programs, new thinking that's gonna create that culture change. And that's what we're dealing with. And it really does create and contribute to the bottom line of the asset. And realistically, our culture demands it, but the banks demand it too. So with that, I just want to open it up to questions for the panel. And thank our panelists. Yes, sir.
Questions always get more complicated to pose than they are to be answered in some ways. But this has been a great presentation. Thank you for everyone's role in putting it together. What you basically talked about is where we are now and how we got to where we are now. And that's great. What I'd like to ask you to postulate on is where we go from here, and in two specific areas. One, with the investment decisions you articulated here, how do you leverage those into your next acquisition? Do you determine now that you're going to buy a new building because it's already green or because it has a great potential under your leadership for making it increasingly green? And the other piece of looking forward is we're all beginning to think in terms of 80 by 50. True scalability. How do we take the lessons you put in place here and how do we envision new construction, or more importantly, since we all know the bulk of the buildings we have now are going to be the same ones we have in hand in 2050. How do we take those exercises, and is it possible to achieve that the current goal of 80 by 50? Two forward questions.
You remember the first one?
Well, I'll jump in on the screening. Sustainability is not about screening real estate for acquisitions. If you have a green fund that will only invest in Energy Star certified buildings or LEED certified buildings, that's fine. That's a target that you're striving for. But just in a generic sense, it's knowing what the level of efficiency a building has will help you underwrite that transaction more intelligently. So if you've got an Energy Star rated building of 95, you've got a pretty good idea that a lot of the savings have been squeezed out of that building and which is simply continue the existing operations. If you're buying a building that has an Energy Star rating of 30, not be afraid of it. You know that you've got a lot of money that you can generate through introducing concepts and principles that will improve the energy efficiency of that building. And if your competitors are not pricing that into their acquisition, you may be able to pay a few pennies more per square foot to get the building and create much greater value by implementing these procedures. So it'll help you be a better acquisitor, not as a screen, unless it's a targeted option.
You know, on the 80 by 50, it's totally doable. It's totally doable. But there's a bunch of obstacles we kind of have to overcome, and they're mostly of our own making. One of those is we need to encourage more distributed generation. Now, I know there's like an initiative right now by the governor's office to talk about the future of the New York grid. But, you know, having a distribution capacity for July 4th and basically running it at, you know, February 2nd or February 24th levels is ridiculous, right? So, you know, Con Ed has this enormous capacity that only peaks out 1 or 2 days of the year, effectively. But, you know, we could change that around and distribute the generation to other locations, and everybody could assume a little bit more responsibility for how energy is created. Another thing you talked about, the solar, you know, more tax incentives for solar, tax breaks for solar, more accelerated depreciation, federal stuff would be very helpful. We're talking to a company about building a solar plant out in someplace in the state where land is cheap, and then taking the credit on our energy bills heating oil will be taxed to death eventually. That's another way of getting to the 80 by 50. LED street lamps. I don't know if you know this, but there's like 500,000 street lamps in New York City. Right? And they're all, these sodium halide type lamps mostly. Well, we could cut our energy emissions immensely or our carbon emissions immensely if we just go through a program of switching to LED, get the same effect as you guys got. And those LED lamps are a solid state device, right? So all of a sudden, we now have a network of over 500,000 solid state devices within 50 feet of each other. So global Wi-Fi in the city for free. Gunshot detection in tough neighborhoods. Cameras where you need them, when you want them. Vision zero possibilities by making sure we keep an eye on those intersections which are tough. Zero pedestrian deaths is totally doable. So, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, but we're gonna have to get right out of the box to do that. And I think that the 80 by 50 is totally doable if we have it at all. And that's what we're going to expect.
Los Angeles has already started converting their street lamps, and essentially what they're doing is they're rolling the program out, so using the energy savings from the first tranche of light changes, fund subsequent changes. I forget what their ultimate delivery date is, but it's a fairly quick process. Within less than 2 years, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I mean, they're a leader on that score, but here's another sort of, different way to look at that, is if you do a rolling change out, you're foregoing energy savings that you could have had if you did it all at once. You see what I mean? You're still wasting energy on that part of your portfolio, which is not efficient. So if you're gonna get capital, like $300 million to change your lights to LED, might as well just do it all at once.
If you can get the capital. The key is, don't make people feel guilty. You want to engage them, you want to show them a better way. You can say, listen, we're foregoing the losses, but the optimistic view is, I'm actually saving energy, I'm going to continue to save energy, and I'm going to do it over time. And if I had the capital, I'd do it all at once, but we don't all have the capital immediately at hand. So it's not about, what I heard years ago, we'll never get to an Energy Star rated building, so what's the point? That's not the point. The point is, even if you don't get to an Energy Star level rated, you take a 30 and make it a 50, you've saved a lot of money, you've reduced your greenhouse gas emissions, you don't have a label, but so what? You got 30 to a 50. You've had tremendous improvement, and that should be celebrated for the achievement. That's how you're going to engage, that's how you're going to encourage and get everybody on board. They've got to see the incremental change. We're not going to solve the problem. We are working towards a solution. 80 by 50, again, it's simply setting a target that we're going to strive for. We don't know what technology changes are around the corner that will suddenly be revolutionary. And maybe 80 by 50 is going to be, we got that in 2038. Set your targets, strive towards them, achieve incremental improvements, and you will get there.
But you do understand that with Energy Star, you've got to be increasing more quickly than your peers. If everyone goes at the same rate, you're all the same number. In fact, you can have significant improvements and your Energy Star score could lower because it's a 0 to 100 compared to your peers.
It's curved. The results of this exam are curved.
Well, no, it's compared to your CBEX database, which right now is still 12 years old. So when they adjust that, everyone's Energy Star rating is going to change. What Energy Star measures is the change in energy use intensity. Nobody understands that, so they don't speak to that. They speak to a rating. It's a simple number, everyone understands, 1 to 100. I was involved in the Boston Green Ribbon Commission several years ago when they were setting up their benchmarking local 84 equivalent, and there was concern, oh my gosh, if we set up a target for 75, an Energy Star rating of 75 or more to achieve the standard, we'll never make it. And it's like, no. You're not comparing to a finite group. You're comparing to a metric. You can have 100% of the buildings in Boston earn an Energy Star certification. There's no limitation in that regard. Your point is well taken. it's compared to the CBEX database. If that changes, when that changes, we're working on it, yeah, all of our ratings are gonna change, but so what? The percentage change that you have achieved doesn't go away. So the 25% energy savings percentages that I have achieved, doesn't matter what my rating is, I've achieved that. I can quantify the dollars that I saved, I can quantify the greenhouse gases that have been avoided. You don't lose that. So the challenge is to move away from the rating, the score. It's a way of keeping track, but it's an arbitrary number. That's not what our objective is. Our objective is become more efficient, save the money, save the greenhouse gas emissions.
One thing I would add to their responses in terms of the 80 by 50 is probably the hardest part of my job, which is the tenant piece. We can do a great job, right? We can make our buildings really efficient, we can pay attention to our run times, we can put a new curtain wall in the building, we can spend millions of dollars, but at the end of the day, we're controlling maybe 40% of the energy that's consumed in our building. And then the other piece is split sometimes 200 ways within just one of our large buildings. And so, what that means for us is like this enormous task of educating your tenant base, convincing them that it's important, and sort of effectuating some kind of behavioral change so that way they, think twice when they leave the office, if it's just turning off the light or turning off their computer. And I think, while, by 2050, most of the leases today will probably have rolled or, maybe they'll be dead, I don't know. But, I think that we need to get these things in place now to start that sort of cultural change about, what do you do at the workplace? What do you care about at the workplace? This isn't your home. You're not paying the bill. How do we as a landlord, what's our role in sort of educating and, this is going to sound cheesy, but inspiring them to make these sort of changes and care, more about what they're doing at work as if it were the, electricity bill they're paying at home.
You're talking about the gamification, energy savings.
On a side note, I know Vornado and a lot of other tenants, they can only control the common area. And Dan's position that the common area, you can only control 40% of the building, the rest is tenants. And I think that from a sustainability perspective, we just hit a fairly major blow in potential tenant reduction because there was a bill introduced a couple of years ago called Tenant Star. And it was adopted by Congress by 95 to 6, I think was the approval rating. And then it had to go through the Senate. And Tenant Star was just recently attached to the Keystone Pipeline bill. Now, what Tenant Star was Energy Star for tenants. So you could get accreditation for your space. So I think every major company, just like the buildings who wanted to get LEED certified and get the star on the door to the building, they would get this star on the door to their space. And I think from a public awareness point of view, companies want to show that they're sustainable, but realistically, tenants really don't care that much about the energy in their space. They care about doing what their business is about. So now, if they could have put Tenant Star certified on the front door, I think that would have made tremendous contributions to the energy savings and the emissions and everything else in the building. But Obama is expected to veto the Keystone Pipeline bill. And there's not enough votes to override it. So this tenant incentive, so to speak, which has been overwhelmingly approved, but now attached to this bill, is not going to take effect till, maybe if we're lucky, 2 years into the next administration. But right now, there really is no public relations incentive, which is very important to tenants and their shareholders and their stakeholders. That doesn't exist.
We've got a wrap, actually. I know the conversation's just kind of getting heated up. But, thank you to the panel. Thanks, Jay, as well. Stick around, and I know we didn't get a lot of opportunity for Q&A here. We typically get a little more right at this roundtable, but go up to them and harass them before they leave, and we're trying to run out quickly.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.